thank you guys for taking the time this evening to join us. I'm personally really excited to sit down here with Justin from Boone and Crockett, and we're going to learn a little bit about the history of Boone and Crockett, and why was Boone and Crockett founded? When did it start? What was the idea behind it, and what is it today? And then toward the end, we're going to also dive into some actual scoring, some of the most common questions that people get, maybe some of the most common errors that people do in scoring. So we'll do some demos. We've got a handful of whitetails and then a elk in the back here that we'll show, or Justin will show some best practices there. So we'll give it just a second here, let a few more folks trickle in, and then we'll kick off with some intros and get this thing going. So just a reminder for everybody on the call, your audio and video are turned off. So I know it's a Zoom call, but we can't see you, we can't hear you, so don't worry about that. We do record these, and usually the next day we get them up on YouTube. So the onX Hunt YouTube channel, if you search there and go back, you'll see all the previous webinars we've done, but this one too will be on YouTube, so you can reference it again if you missed something or want to share it with some hunting buddies who couldn't make it tonight, so on and so forth. One final thing is, make sure if you're asking questions, which we'll get to questions at the end, make sure that you are putting those in the Q&A section and not the chat. So the chat's still good. Be sure to throw in there where you're tuning in from. But if, as far as like a question you'd like us to answer, make sure it's in the Q&A section. So with that, we'll dive in. Actually, first, let me back up. We'll do a couple quick introductions here, and then I'll kick it over and we'll get going. But I'll go first. Dylan Dowson with onX, on the onX side here. I've been with onX for a little over 7 years now. And yeah, hunting is my passion, would be if I worked here or not. I just happen to have a job that aligns with my passion, which is super cool. And we get to work with the folks at Boone and Crockett and a lot of other really cool organizations. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I will kick it over to you.
Appreciate it, Dylan. I'm Justin Spring. I'm the director of Big Game Records for Boone and Crockett. I've been with the club here in Missoula for, this is my 15th year, I think. And so what we're going to do here is to understand the scoring of this stuff, you guys need to kind of know a little bit of the history of the club and how we got to where we were with the scoring system. It adapted until the 1950s, but we'll get into that here. So we're going to start 1803 Lewis and Clark, or the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark Expedition 1804. At this time, wildlife east of the Mississippi was starting to go downhill, but this whole western half of the country was basically unexplored. September 3rd of 1804, we see the first time that pronghorn and jackrabbits appear in Western literature. So 1804, we had not even, the West didn't even know what a pronghorn was. By the 1850s, we made it out to the West Coast, and wildlife populations were just being decimated. In 2 days in San Francisco, they collected 1,200 murre eggs in the 1850s, excuse me. This was the heyday of market hunting. So a muskrat was equal to a quarter, a raccoon a third of a dollar, a doe skin a $50, a buckskin the almighty dollar. All bison east of the Mississippi had been extirpated. So at this point, there's two major players in the beginning of Boone and Crockett. There's Theodore Roosevelt and also George Bird Grinnell, who we'll come to next. But they both kind of came from a different background. Roosevelt was born in 1858, kind of to put this in context. 1859, Darwin publishes Origin of Species. So that gives you an idea kind of at the time period in science and whatnot that was going on. You can see in TR's early life, he was very active. He traveled the world. He went to the Middle East. He made collections. He started a museum in his house. But basically, this is all building up into 1884, his first child is born on February 12th. His mother dies on the 14th, and his wife passes hours later. He's distraught. He goes back out west, goes to the Elkhorn, starts his cattle ranch, does that. As he's out there, he's hunting the Bighorn Mountains of Montana, writes The Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. George Bird Grinnell, born in 1849, he was actually taught elementary school by Lucy Audubon, as in James Audubon's wife. So his early education was with all the skins and everything of Audubon. So very, very scientific background, graduates from Yale. He goes out west on a fossil collecting expedition, participates in the last Great Pawnee hunt, serves as a naturalist on Custer's Black Hills expedition. Thanks, laid out the next one. So he was very into this, but Grinnell was a very behind the scenes educated man. Roosevelt was, I mean, he was educated, but he was the center of attention. He was the guy beating on his chest. And so these two come together. Roosevelt writes this Hunting Tales of a Ranchman. Grinnell is the editor of Forest and Stream magazine, which would become Field and Stream. It's the eminent outdoor publication and journal basically of the day. There was no field of wildlife, so this was where the naturalists compared notes. So he writes a scathing review of Roosevelt. Roosevelt meets him. The two of them meet. They realize something has to be done about the West. That's the founding of Boone and Crockett Club, was those two. 1887, Roosevelt hosts a dinner party of 10 of his friends. TR is elected president, but this is really the founding of Boone and Crockett. Some of our first mission was Yellowstone was already a national park, but there was no real background to it. There was no rules. Grinnell had actually noted when he was out there illegal harvest of timber and game. So the first thing the club did was help protect Yellowstone. But we also, very soon, 1895, the very first sportsman's expedition was held in New York City. This was the first time Boone and Crockett had an interest in records. And at the time, there wasn't a methodology. It was Roosevelt and a couple other guys, and they're like, oh, that's a nice bull. I like those fours, plus 2 points. Like literally, it was a very arbitrary system. So that's kind of where it started. You know, the criteria they used is outlined in this second book we did, The Hunting in Many Lands. So 1901, President McKinley shot. 8 days later, he dies. Roosevelt sworn in as the 26th president. 1902, First Records Committee is appointed. So that's Casper Whitney, Archibald Rogers, Theodore Roosevelt. So those were the very first guys that were kind of tasked with what's this system going to be. You know, at the same time, we have the Reclamation Act taking place. Roosevelt's quite busy. 1906 is Boone and Crockett's first scoring book. This was more of a personal journal, like hunting log of, you know, the beam length and this and that. It was notes for the hunter. But this was the beginning of BNC's records. This is a highly collectible book. Very few exist. But this was Boone and Crockett's very first scoring book. At this same time, the future of wildlife looked absolutely dismal. And so the club thought that everything was going to be eradicated. They didn't think our generation would ever see what was once on the continent or the world. And so they started a mission to collect the best specimen of every category of big game and put it on display in the Bronx Zoo. That was our start. Like what was once here, show the future generations. This went on till 1922 when the Bronx.
Excuse me real quick. What year was that first started?
So 1906 to 1922 was when they were putting that collection together in the Bronx Zoo. Our first couple records books were done under the auspices of the National Collection of Heads and Horns, meaning basically it just highlighted what was in there. You know, this is part of another presentation. We do a lot with Pope and Young, but 39, they started keeping records of, you know, archery taken animals. So this is why this is in there. But so 47, Boone and Crockett hosts its first big game competition. These are now called awards programs. At the time, invited the top heads. It became readily apparent that the system we have wasn't going to work. It was way too arbitrary, depending on who the judge was. And so this next slide, after this 47, they put together this committee in 1949. And this is the founding of Boone and Crockett Records. Gransel Fitz, who was the top picture there with the cow's buck. He was a photographer, advertising photographer in New York. He'd hunted all of North America. He killed all North American game with a 30-06. That was kind of his claim to fame. The guy on the bottom left is Jimmy Clark, or James L. Clark. He was a taxidermist that held his own competitions for trophies that his clients had taken. So those two each had their own system. That was the very beginning of Boone and Crockett. These two kind of hammered it out. And what they were looking for was traits that would be present in the top male specimen from the perfect habitat, right? So what's the common form of the animal? What do you see? They eventually decided on mass, symmetry, time length. But this was the 1949 committee, 1950.
I'm gonna back up real
Yep.
quick. First question is cows or coos, and where did the other one come from, and why is it so popular?
If you're down in Arizona, it is 100% coos deer.
Coos.
The locals say that. The guy who it was named after was Elliot Cows. He was quite adamant that that's how his name was pronounced. Depending on what state I'm in,
Tomato.
directs how I say that to not offend people.
Sounds good.
Anyway, so this was our first 30 categories recognized in 1950. You can see the minimums at the time were some of them quite a bit lower. For example, a whitetail, 140 whitetail made Boone and Crockett at the time. So anyway, this was the original system in 1950. And this is the same system we're using today. That's what I'm going to be teaching you guys about now. What you can see here is one of our scoring diagrams. Boone and Crockett's system is teed up to recognize the typical or the common form of the species. You hear a lot about, abnormal points, non-typical, typical. Boone and Crockett's system is designed to recognize traits of the common form. So a whitetail, this buck you brought in here is a great example. I mean, this is a very classic, massive, decently long tine, heavy buck. This is what our system is looking for. You will see on the mule deer, again, the common form of a mule deer, 5 normal points, bifurcated antlers. This is on mule deer for Boone and Crockett scoring. You can only ever have 5 normal points. Whitetail, the total number of normal points is unlimited as long as they are matched. It roughly equals spacing out the beam. And then the final diagram before we dive in on scoring whitetail here is just the overall form of what Boone and Crockett recognizes as the typical form of an elk. And that's what we have here is, the 6-point, 7-point type bull. Again, elk do not have a maximum number of normal points. Everything, the G4 and lower is named. Above that, again, it's matched in symmetry throughout. And so we'll go back to the whitetail diagram. And, basically I'm going to go through, I'm not going to score the thing fully, but I'm going to put tape on and kind of show everybody how we build up to this. How we assign time length, where we draw baselines, all the different rules that come into play. So the first thing I ever do when I'm going to score deer is you're going to put tape on the antlers, and this is going to be where the baselines are. This is very useful because as we take our main beam length, we need to stay in the middle of this main beam. And so if I put a baseline here, which is going to signify where the top of that beam is, it's far easier for me to follow the center of that because I have reference lines all the way out. So, first thing I do is I'm going to tape it up.
So you do that for every time.
Yeah. I mean, rough scoring one in camp, you might eyeball it if it's not dry or whatever. But yeah, anytime we're going to do something, somewhat official, we're gonna put these on in, especially when you're just starting out. After you've done 500 racks, you can kind of see where that center is. But especially starting, I really like having these baselines on here. If you can need to zoom in on this. Okay. So basically, in essence, what you're going to do when you're putting these lines on, I'm going to use my cable, and I'm going to need your help here to be able to see on this outside. What I'm doing with this cable is I'm putting it on the top edge of the beam, and I'm trying to reflect any natural curvature in the bottom. So basically what that means is, what would this beam have done had this tine never happened? So it's going to come up and naturally curl. Well, if this curl is happening right in my baseline, I need to indicate that in the baseline. So I'm not going to drop straight. That's going to increase my length. So I'm trying to, and again, I'll turn it around here and make sure I have it. But again, you can see that this is a great example. You've got that big curl there.
Yep.
I need that to appear in my.
So you're just matching that on the top side.
Parallel. This
Okay.
This beam would have a parallel edge. It wouldn't drop down. It wouldn't jut up. It's going to be the exact same angle. So once we have that of where that would naturally fall, you always mark the underside of the tape.
Underside.
The
That's
bottom,
my first mistake.
The bottom edge of the cable is sitting on the top of the antler.
Okay.
So we've assigned this as the top of the antler. So the bottom edge of that's going to be our 0 line. So then we go ahead, you're going to do that all the way out. On G1s, you're going to do the same thing. This is very important. On a G1, with any tine, you take the greatest outside curve. So if this tine comes up and rolls out, you can actually take it from the center or from the inside, but it's always the outside curve. On a G1, very commonly, they'll come forward, they'll come back. They're very rarely always forward facing, right? So you can take the center of the front or the center of the back. This is important. You cannot take from the top edge or the bottom edge. It has to be the center of the tine, but you can be on the front side of it or the back side of it.
Okay.
So anytime I'm doing a G1, I'm going to put tape on both sides. This is another good example. It's kind of rolly. It starts in, it goes out, it starts back. So it could be either side. We're going to give it the longest outside curve on G1.
So would you measure both and then determine which is, if you're officially doing
Yep.
it?
For what I do, I eyeball which one I think is going to be the longest one. I have a little alligator clip here. So as I pull the cable tight, I'll mark it. Then I can throw it on the other side and quickly see if the other side's longer or shorter. You always give it the longest.
While you're doing that, for anybody, and I'm sure this question will come up, but if people are looking for the sheets, like your guys' is actually official sheets of like a reference guide to do this, what's the best way? Your guys' website? Or?
Yep. So our website, boone-crockett.org. There is a section on there under the hunt tab that says score chart PDFs. There's also an online scoring calculator. The score chart PDFs, you can print them off and fill them out. The scoring calculator does the math for you. Everybody has kind of their own difference, opinion. So now that we've got this on here, I'm going to show this front side. This is another common mistake we see. There is a raised ridge on this G1, but it's to the downside of this tine. When we are taking the length of this tine, it must start in the center of this projection and stay in the middle of the tine to the top. Do not get falsely pulled to one side or the other by a raised ridge. Okay. It's the greatest outside curve of the tine.
Let's see here. Excuse us. Just stop sharing. Yep. You're good.
Okay, so it's the greatest outside curve of the tine, but not to the front or the back. So we'll put this baseline on here. And be aware when you're looking at this stuff, I've dealt with this, whenever something's being filmed, the angle of where the lines, they don't look where they want. So don't look and be like, oh, it looks like he was a little bit high. What I'm trying to do is put it right on the very edge where that beam would have been had this time not happened. So then on something like this, I'm going to look at the time, find the exact center of it. So I've got an X right there, right where my start point is.
Do you start with the time zone first? Does it matter?
It doesn't. It doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter if it's a typical or a non-typical. The only thing is everybody kind of makes their own in their mind how to do it to make sure they get through everything. I like to do the tines first, then the beams. But again, there's no right or wrong way as long as you do everything and keep it correct, left or right.
Gotcha.
It does matter on some categories like caribou, depending on where your beam is, might change your tip to tip.
Okay.
But on a white,
or like pronghorn, where don't you need the length before you can do mass?
Correct. Any horned animal, you do need to know your longer horn. But on whitetail, it doesn't matter. It's just length of tines, circumferences at specified locations. So as I said, I'm going to come to the tip. Here's my trick. I'm going to mark this front side, whip it around to the back. Same deal. This is my baseline. Follow it up. So in fact, the back of this is actually longer.
Yeah.
We're going to adjust that. That's the length of G1 that you're going to get, is this longer curve on the back.
Interesting. I mean, that was probably quarter inch or
half
eighth?
inch, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's quite a bit on there. And so again, I wasn't as particular on my baselines as I would be officially, but that gives you the idea. So now that we've got our tape on, our baselines on, I'm going to show you how we do a main beam length. There's a couple ways you hear some guys say, okay, well, you go to the back of the center back of the eyeball and go straight up. I've never been able to use this as a reference point to find the middle that I'm confident in. What I like to do is I hold the rack out, close one eye so I can't see the backside. That ensures I'm looking right at it from the side. I find the exact center of this antler. If there's a chunk hanging down or if there's a big chunk missing there, the rules say you take it in the center, so there's nothing ever done to that. If you get a little bit added, in theory, it's going to come out in deductions on the other side. So it's always from the exact center. I'm going to have you tape this on as I put it on so we can show this beam.
When you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead and just start taping as I work my way out here.
Is that enough?
Yep, that should hold. Yep. Now, again, this deer has a little bit of a swale in its beam, how it grew. And so we're gonna try to mimic that as we put this on. There's gonna be a little bit of rise and then a drop, and then it's gonna come back up as we come out here. Put one right out there on the tip. So you can see there, that's how we just stay right in the middle.
Okay.
It doesn't get pulled too far back. It doesn't ride the front edge. It's a slow transition from the center down here. Once we get to here, we have our baseline. We know we have to come through the middle of the beam. And so you just a nice transition up to there, all the way out to the tip.
And it's always on the outside, correct?
It's the outside cut.
Okay.
I've never seen a whitetail
Yeah, flare out or something
that
like
would
that.
flare out
Yeah,
hard enough.
okay.
You'd have to come from the outside on that.
Gotcha.
But I mean, that's kind of the basics on the tine length and the beam length. There's don't overcomplicate it. Again, like I said, Boone and Crockett recognizes the typical form. So if something falls outside the typical form, an abnormal type of growth, that's what it's called, an abnormal. And so this is a pretty good example on this buck here. You've got G1s clearly, 2s, nice match 3s. These are your 4s. You've got this single tine coming off the inside, not even off the outside of the beam, just out of an odd location. This is not a common place to see a tine on a whitetail, so therefore it's scored as an abnormal point. Abnormals are treated very similar to the rest of the tines in that we're going to take the greatest outside curve. This is important. Say you've got a typical deer, you can't take the shortest outside curve because you want it to do better as a typical and not get the deductions. It's always the greatest outside curve. When we put our baseline on these, again, we're going to say, where would this tine and this beam have been? Would this have been had this never happened? So it's a very similar process. We put tape on there. This one, there's a pretty good indentation. You can see right where it was. But we do the same thing, mark the outside, mark the inside, take both and mark down the longest. Again, abnormal tines, they can be anywhere. Any tine off of a tine on a whitetail is an abnormal, anything off the bottom, the outside, the inside. There could only be one G1. If you have matching G1, double G1s on both sides, one of those is going to be an abnormal. That is not a common trait on a whitetail. They have one single tine that comes off the brow. Double or splits, those are going to be abnormal.
So one question I have a whitetail at home actually that has a double on one side and like a trip laggard on the other side of G1. So would you take, and I've always wondered this, is it the tallest one is the actual G1, the shortest? Like, how do you determine what's the actual G1?
So our system is trying to look at the common form.
Okay.
And so commonly you'll see one that that's the G1 structure. This is coming off the front, this is coming off the back. In that case, you take the G1 structure. There is times that it comes up, it forks equally. There's no dominant front back. In that case, again, you're trying to find what would match the best. But in that particular case, if they're equally G1-esque, you can pick the one that helps the deer the best.
Gotcha.
But that's only if you have two options that had one not happened. The other one would clearly be the G1. That is the only time that you can say what's going to help the final score the best.
Okay.
And so anyway, he'd mentioned where to get our score charts on the Boone and Crockett website. The next thing is circumferences. Circumferences are listed on the score chart. There is given locations that each one must be taken. It doesn't matter if you shoot a spike or a 12-point. There's always 4 circumferences on both sides for a whitetail, antlered game other than moose. The first one is always going to be between the burr and the G1. You take it at the smallest place, so you pull your tape around there. There is a right, wrong way to do it. You see on the 0 mark, you have a line that goes up.
Yep.
I can put that right on the bottom there and see exactly to the 32nd where that measurement is. And so I wrap it around and I'm looking for the smallest place. Anywhere between burr and G1, it's always the smallest. If when you're taking any measurement, a tine length or a circumference, it falls on the 16th, it rounds up. If it falls below the 16th, it rounds down. So the 16th or higher, it goes up to the next nearest 8th. One thing that a lot of people we see, yes, Boone and Crockett is aware that 4/8 equals 1/2. We always leave a score unreduced so that I know when we're reviewing that the measure rounded to the nearest 8th and not half or quarter.
Okay.
If they put down quarter, we can assume they rounded to 8ths, but if they leave it in 8ths, that helps us know that yes, indeed, they did round to the nearest 8th, or in the case of bears, 16th. So
Gotcha.
yeah, and yeah, I always get a hard time anytime I'm filmed though, 4/8, yeah, I know it's a half, or 6/8 is 3/4, obviously, but that's why we use that verbiage there. So find the smallest there. The next one is between your G1 and G2. Again, work it up and down, find the smallest. G2, G3 is going to be the same thing. And then G3, G4. This one's a pretty clear-cut deer on where that's going to be. On this side, we have that abnormal point. An abnormal can never be a separator for a circumference, okay? So this is our G2, this is our G3. This abnormal doesn't do anything. So it's the smallest between here and here. It could be taken here or here. In this case, this is the smallest, but G1 or H1, excuse me, H2, H3, H4. I've got another deer here. And like I said, there's always 4 circumferences. Regardless of what they've grown, we're going to get 4. This particular buck has absolutely no G1 on the left side. In this case, since there's no attempt, there's no bump, there's nothing, both your H1 and H2 will be taken at the same spot, which is the smallest between the burr and the G2. Again, now you have a G2, G3, you'll take the smallest there. Your H4 circumference, anytime you basically run out of tines, what you're gonna, I need the tape again.
One of the common misconceptions that I always heard growing up is if a buck didn't have quote unquote eye guards or brow tines, you missed a mass measurement.
Yeah.
So like for years, I was under that assumption and being like, well, man, that buck, if he had only had, an inch eye guard, he would have had another mass and been this or that. So
the other interesting thing with Boone and Crockett, if there is an attempt at a point, you can use it for a separator.
Okay.
So if there's a bump there where that eye guard would have been, even if it doesn't qualify, you can identify it and say that was an attempt at a point that is appropriate to use as a separator for circumferences. I brought this one because there's nothing there. This is completely smooth. So in this case, they're both taken at the same spot. With this one, we put our baseline on. We'd already done that because we're scoring already. You come to the exact center of the tine. We then, to find this circumference location, you measure from this to the tip, divide that in half, and it is taken exactly where that falls. If there's a bump there, if there's something there, the manual, the rules state we take it at the midpoint. So no matter what, you come right down the center of that tine, take it to the tip, divide that in two, and that is where your H4 circumference comes on this particular deer. You know, if you had a forked horn, this didn't happen. You'd have two down here and two at the midpoint out the beam if there was not a G3. Couple other interesting things, you know why they're called G points?
No.
Because when we were making the score chart, G happened to be the letter we were on as we were lining everything out. There's no meaning to the G's or the H's.
That was actually a question I was going to ask you, is why H? Why?
Yeah, it's just as they were laying it out, they put letters to denote where they were on how it would be added up, and they happen to be the G's and H's. It's not near as exciting as I think people would want it to be. Another good example, you'd mentioned if it was missing an eye guard, another misconception, oh, it's 6 up, I get an extra circumference. No. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's no circumference taken here regardless. It's always 4. If you had a spike, it'd be the midpoint of the spike. You'd still get 4 circumferences on that. I guess
and then width would be, I guess the only other thing, right?
Yep, on white
It's
still.
It's not outside.
No, so Boone and Crockett does require greatest and tip to tip spread. We are a data set, right? And so we do keep track of those. It is important that they're taken correctly. It would unduly reward an overly wide deer if we added all 3 of those into the final tally. And so we only use the greatest inside spread. Tip to tip and greatest is still important. We want that in our data set when one's entered, but it does not factor into the score. So when you're doing your greatest inside spread, it must be taken from the center of the beam to the center of the beam. And this one's actually not a very good example because it's a little crooked, but it's got to be perpendicular to the axis of the skull. So this is the axis, right? Okay. So it's got to be straight across from the center of the beam to the center of the beam. You can't tilt it. It can't be, off center there. I'm actually going to use that book you brought in. I think it's a little better to demonstrate this.
So that one would be pretty far out, potentially on the beam itself.
Yeah, it would. And the problem there is that one beam sits a little lower. And so what I would have to do is get a level and bring it up. So I was perpendicular, right straight across. And that's version 2.
Yeah.
Tonight, we're just looking at the center of the beam to the center of the beam.
Let's see advanced class.
Right. So I like this ruler that has a metal slide. This one's kind of sticky, but the same deal as we did with the circumferences. We can come in the middle and just work our way up and down here, trying to find the widest place between the center of the beam and the center of the beam, perpendicular to that axis that we're looking for.
Okay.
If your beams flare out, if they flare in, it doesn't matter. It's always the center to the center. Commonly, you'll see somebody, want to go, this one's a good example. They kind of come in. No, you don't have to take it up here. You can add a couple 8s there by coming to the center of the beam to the center of the beam. This is another good example. We talked about circumferences at a given location. This has an abnormal growth in there. This is not going to qualify for a point. For anything other than caribou, a point must be at least 1 inch long and length must exceed width at 1 inch or more. And so if at an inch down, the point's an inch wide, but say an inch and 2/8 down, it's an inch and 1/8 wide. Any place that length exceeds width at 1 inch or more, the entire projection qualifies as a point.
Okay.
So this one is not going to be a point. You do have some inflated material here. This is where Boone and Crockett's system is kind of self-regulating and why, gross scores are cool to talk about, but it kind of can be misleading. This is going to inflate your gross, but when it comes out in deductions, this is going to get equalized, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why when we talk nets and whatnot, yes, this is cool. It doesn't take anything away from the trophy value, but when you're trying to look at the health of the animal and what it grew and is an indicator of habitat health and everything, that's why that net number is so important to us and why everything we do is a net. And 100%, you're fine. Oh, gross is this, but the net at the end of the day is what our system's looking for. And it's that It's that symmetry, it's that mass, and so that's what we've always
Do you
done.
guys, out of curiosity, I know it's really a huge data set. Do you
Mhm.
guys store the grosses as well? Is that like a data
It
set
is,
of interest to
it
you?
is something that hunters were interested enough in it, and it is useful.
Mhm.
I can tell you, hey, I shot a buck that netted 162 and grossed 164. You're like, oh,
Yeah.
wow, that's a super
Very.
typical clean buck, not a lot of deductions. I can say, hey, I shot a buck that grossed, 195 and netted 165. You're like, oh, okay, it's got some mismatch, probably got some abnormals. And so if you're looking at it numerically, it does have a value.
Mhm.
And that's why we did elect to keep it on file and list it in our books now. We'll list the gross score, but we
Okay.
don't rank by it or anything.
Yeah.
It's just it's the same as like the widest buck ever shot.
Hang on here while we kick these lights back on. Thanks, sir. Motion activated.
The widest buck ever shot. That's a cool
Yeah.
thing, but it doesn't really mean that that's the world record type deal. It's the same with gross. It's a great additional number. It's good to know. It doesn't necessarily affect what we're looking at for the trends of wildlife. So,
Okay.
What other questions did we miss on whitetail?
I think that covers a lot of it. Really,
Yeah.
it's, like you said, the way that I've done it, and I don't do it near as, exact as you, but when I'm like rough, if you're sitting around a campfire and want to get a rough measurement, how I've done it is like beam, then time length, then mass, and basically you add it up and there's your gross. What's the best way outside of, I guess just what's the best way to go from that gross score to a net?
So basically, if you take the small side, and this is a quick way to do it,
Mhm.
you want your net, you measure the shortest of each tine all the way up. Okay, so this one's a bit shorter. We're gonna measure this one. Looks like this one might be a bit shorter. So if you take the shortest of each tine and the smallest mass and double it, that'll give you your net.
Okay.
If you take the longer side and you're again doing it quick in camp, that's gonna get you closer to the gross. So if you just always take the shorter and double it, that's gonna give you what that green net score
Even if
is.
it's on the opposite side.
Right, because this one's gonna be 7, this one's gonna be 4, something
Yeah.
like, well, it's not, but
Yeah.
this 3 inches is gonna come out. So you're gonna have a 3-inch deduction off of that number. If you take the shortest and double it, that's the credit you're gonna get on both sides.
Gotcha.
And so that's the quick, dirty way to get to a net. And a gross, you take the long, if you want a true gross, you kind of split the difference.
Yeah.
To take half the longer, half the shorter and double it, that's gonna get you pretty close. Another interesting thing is, if you want to go from, there's no difference in typical or non-typical scoring. They're always scored the same. Each time is treated the same. It's purely how they're added up. So if you have a typical buck that, say it's got 6 inches of abnormal points, if you double that 6 inches, that will give you its non-typical score.
Okay.
Because as a typical, that 6 inches comes out. Well, you add it in one time to get back to square, and then it's added in a non-typical. So you take a typical score, double the inches of abnormal points, and that will give you your non-typical score. There's still left to right deductions. Everything else is still done the same. It's just how those abnormal points are treated. So that's another quick way to say, this typical, this non-typical, just look at the
Gotcha.
score chart.
And yeah, especially if you're doing it like roughly at camp or whatever,
Yeah.
or just roughly if, it's not, if you're not looking for precise, like it really doesn't take that long to do both sides anyways. Like if you just want to whip it out. But what would if you were doing, say, this buck officially, how long roughly would it take you?
This one's pretty clean, pretty straightforward. You could probably get this one done in, I'd say, 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay.
Again, depending on if you have somebody to help you hold it and all that.
Versus a rough, probably 10,
Yeah.
if that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the non-typicals, I was just at Pope and Young's judges panel. There was 2 heads there that took 8 hours apiece.
Wow.
So again, the more trash, the more, abnormalities you have to deal with, the harder it gets. Another good trick is you have a deer that has a bunch of abnormalities. We use different colored tape. So we'll put green tape on all the normal points, red tape on all the abnormals. And then as you score them, if you've got 30 points you're dealing with, you pull off the piece of tape to ensure that you never double measure something.
Interesting.
And so, again, you asked about the order in which you do things. That would be, another helpful hint to help people out.
I have yet to shoot a deer that needs that
Right.
multicolored tape. Yeah, that's cool.
We're all trying now.
Or you have to pull it off so you don't accidentally double count it.
Right.
Well, cool. No, I think that covers it. I'm sure we got a bunch of questions we'll get to. Looks like we're sitting pretty good on time. You want to run through some
Yeah, I was
quick
gonna,
elk stuff?
I mean, elk is real similar in terms of beam length. You know, we're gonna measure the tines, we're gonna take 4 circumferences. There is a little bit of a variation in elk on how we measure G1. I don't know the history on this, but I'll show you guys as we put the baseline on the G1s. And this is the biggest difference and a very common error that we see when people that are very good at measuring and very precise and maybe aren't, haven't been through a course or whatever, the G1s is the one spot they'll mess up.
Yep.
So historically,
That's the best way. We might need to
yeah,
move the camera back here real quick.
all right, so on our deer, our first circumference is always between the burr and G1. On elk, our first circumference falls between the G1 and G2. So that's one thing to remember on elk. We're always going to come here for our first circumference. Our baseline on a G1 on an elk is going to be taken right across the side. And when we start measuring a G1, we start in the center of the tine. We come out till it naturally transitions to the underside, and then we come to the tip. You can come down real quick and follow this outside curve and greatly increase that length of G1 if not done correctly.
So it's a natural transition.
Yep. And this is something that it's not a change, but we've with this, we try to find a way to put it in writing where it's reproducible every time.
Yep.
We don't want anything in our scoring system that's arbitrary. Inherently, there's some things in there that, become a judgment call. But at the end of the day, I'm super happy if everything's answered like it's a black and white set of rules. Here's how it's done. So what we do on this for our baseline on a G1, I'm going to push this cable right down against this burr here. Okay. And then I'm going to have it right in the crotch between the 1 and the 2. Again, I'm going to mark the under edge. I'm going to find the center of this projection, which is going to be right there. And then as I measure it, see how it's naturally just comes straight out that till it naturally comes to this under edge.
Yep.
And then I turn and follow the center of this tine up to the tip. And so that's going to be how you take a G1. Once we get above there, same thing as before. We're going to have it on both sides of the beam. Where would the beam have been had this tine not happened? We're then going to take the center of the tine, follow it at the center all the way out. Do not get pulled up or down by a ridge.
Yeah, I can see that one. You might be able to.
Right.
A little bit.
Another interesting note on elk, G3s quite commonly do not come off the top of the beam. You can see on this one, the base of this G3 is actually coming all the way down about halfway into the beam. Remember when I talked about taking our beam lengths and using these as reference?
Yep.
You can get your baseline or your beam length pulled way down on a G3 because if you incorrectly say that's the top of the beam, that's going to bring it all the way here. And so a G3 can come out the side of the beam. This is the top of the beam right here, right? And so we're staying in the center of that. Our center line is going to be up right across the base of this G3. Okay. So that's another common spot on elk, especially Montana bulls. Those threes seem to come out the side of the beam. Yeah. It's just a very common trait of our bulls. The G4 I touched on following the underside curve. You know how we've got that natural bend there?
Yep.
G4s on elk, it can make a huge difference. Look how much we add if we cut that straight across. That is not what that beam would have done. We need this to be parallel to this under edge. And so we're actually up something like that.
Okay.
Whereas, that's there, pull it tight. There's 2 3/8 right there.
Yep.
That you could inflate a 4. Again, like I said on elk, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s are all named. You know what your sort is. Anytime you're looking at an elk, find your sword, find your G4, and work back. If there's double G3s, one of them is going to be an abnormal. If you're missing a 1 or a 2, those tines have to be there. But once you get above 4, then it goes to, equally spaced and matched coming off the top of the beam. You could have 7, 8, 9, 10 points out here as long as they're matched, that they're all normal. But if there's a missing, 2, 3, 3, 4, 2, or 1, that would be put on the score chart as 0. Another thing, I did not touch on this on whitetail, but it applies to elk too. If it has an unmatched tine at the end of the beam, in essence, it disappears. Because if you've got say you've got a G6 on this side, 6 inches long, well, there's none on the other side. So you have a 6-inch tine and then a 6-inch left to right deduction or difference. So that tine doesn't happen. That's only at the end of the beam. Okay, so if you have a 6x8, those last 2 points basically don't count. You still shoot that bull every day of the week. But if you're worried about a score, that is to note that those last 2 tines look really awesome. But at the end of the day, they're not going to help that score a ton. So,
Gotcha.
Other questions on elk?
I don't think so. I think that for me, the biggest, until I honestly looked at your guys' sheet and saw the mass measurements, like I was so used to 1's here, 2's here, 3's here, and then 4. But yeah, that was a common misconception or error on my part. Width wise, it's pretty much the same, right?
Exactly.
Same as
And one thing, I mean, it's the center of the beam to the center of the beam.
Yeah.
Occasionally a new score may be tempted to come up onto a 4. You can't do that. It's got to be in the center of the beam to the center of the beam. The other thing is very commonly people think it has to be right here, which very, very likely that is your widest.
Yep.
A lot of bulls come up and naturally grow out.
So it could be at the end of the beams.
It could, in theory, be your tip to tip.
Okay.
The issue with that, though, is that very rarely are the tips of the antlers going to be directly across from each other, perpendicular to the skull. So generally what you'll have is, if it is all the way at the end of the beams, you'll be on the tip on one side and then back maybe 2 or 3 inches on the other, just to make sure you've got it squared up. But that's another place that, as long as it's not damaged and like it was hurt in the velvet and flares out, you can't take that all the way, almost out to the tips. Center of the beam to the center of the beam. In theory, you could have a tip to tip and greatest inside the same. We've never seen it though, because of the left, right, and rounding and everything. It could happen, but it's just not common.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that pretty much covers it. Probably got a handful of questions.
Yeah.
All right, we'll get this repositioned back and get to some questions. Mule deer really too is probably pretty, there's really no nuances with the mule deer versus whitetail, right?
No, your G3 must come off the front of your G2.
Gotcha.
But, you can't have a G3 off of a beam. But again, if you look at the score chart, it's pretty straightforward on.
Gotcha. 1 second here. All right. Question number 1, I like it because there's a internal debate between me and a few folks here at the office. Is it brow tine or Nygaard?
Again, completely depends on where, or is it an 8-point or a 4x4?
Okay.
For us, it's a G1.
Okay.
An eye guard, it's all interchangeable. A royal tine, a sword tine, a G4. There's no steadfast. This is what's in the book. The original was brow, bay, tray was on elk, was 1, 2, and 3.
Interesting.
But even that, that verbiage is no longer used. So
okay.
you look at our original
where did that verbiage come from?
That's on our original score chart. Like I was given that presentation on when it was very arbitrary and kind of a personal note. Yeah, some of the first score charts, it said bay tine, tray tine, right up the line on an elk. So
okay, interesting. Let's see. I've been an official measure for Pope and Young Club since 2007. Pope and Young Club uses Boone and Crockett scoring systems. So I'm curious when and if Boone and Crockett will allow Pope and Young measures to measure for B and C?
So that's actually a really good question. That is correct. Boone and Crockett does. Pope and Young uses our system. We work very closely. I just mentioned I was at Pope and Young's panel. The reason that we have not, and why Boone and Crockett asks them to come to a workshop, is we feel that the history and the mission of Boone and Crockett is just as important as the scoring. Hence the reason I actually went into the history of the club before we got into this. And so I am offering a workshop for Pope and Young majors at their convention this summer. It's one day, which is very heavy on the history of the club. And so, yeah, if he's interested in coming to that workshop, get a hold of Pope and Young's headquarters, and we do work with them very close. And yes, the scoring is the same. It's just what our mission is, and their mission is very slightly, but we are working to get everybody certified in both organizations.
Cool. And that's one of the really cool things for me is, maybe the first time when I was a kid and I heard of Boone and Crockett, you think of like these numbers, right? Like, is it in the book? And then you come to learn some of the history and like why it was founded and the conservation behind it. And to me, it was super cool to learn, because the first time I personally heard it was like, I want a Boone and Crockett mule deer because they're big.
Right.
But
and it's part of it. And it's kind of hunters want to have their name in a book. They want recognition. But at the end of the day, the reason we continue the records, it gives us this data set. Are we causing damage? Are we doing good? Our bears getting bigger? Our bears getting smaller? And so it's a dual purpose. Yeah, it's cool to have your name in a book. It's awesome to get your name in the magazine and have a number. But at the end of the day, why I go to work is to make sure that we're not hurting wildlife. And we do that by looking at the very top end of those mature male specimens.
Yep. Awesome. If I heard correct, mule deer are limited to 5 points on each side. If so, why, or explain what was intended?
Again, that was in the 1950s when they said that the typical mule deer has that bifurcated antler, the fork in the front, fork in the back, and potentially a G1. That was what the common form was. That's what the system recognizes. Boone and Crockett system is not perfect. No system out there is perfect. We did the best we could off of what we thought the common animal was. If we could go back to 1950, I'm sure there's a couple things we tweak. The G1s on elk, I don't really understand why we do that. But once you have a data set so long, some of that stuff we just have to stick with.
Yeah, because if you change it now, it's...
caribou are a prime example. Caribou, whoever made the category that was assigned to that, really liked big top palms. Yeah. We measure top palms 3 times. No other category do we measure horn material or antler material twice. And so that's probably why it was 5. At the time, that's what they thought. And then we can't change can't change it now. Change circumferences and change everything. So some of this stuff we're just kind of stuck with because, Fitz and Clark decided that was it back in 1940.
Gotcha. Makes sense though. Can you explain the process and value of DNA testing blacktail versus mule deer?
So historically the Cascade Range served as a very good barrier between mule deer and blacktail. As things change, it's not quite as apparent, and the further south you get, the less drastic it is, and so there's a lot of crossover. When they made the blacktail category, they set the boundary very conservative. So we knew if it was taken west of this line, there was absolutely no way statistically it'd be a mule deer. DNA has come along now to the point where we know some of those deer that we were excluding are 100% blacktail. It gives us the ability to verify those. And at the same time, we've had deer come in that were thought to be blacktails. And it was a very credible story. The family grandpa always hunted this part of the Oregon coast. What we find out with genetics is, other than that one year that he went to Colorado with his buddies. And so, like I said, it's not calling somebody a liar, but it just ensures our records are pure. And it's a great tool for us to have now at our disposal. And we get to include some deer that historically we wouldn't if we didn't have that.
Yeah, interesting. What is the process to become an official scorer for Boone and Crockett?
So for Boone and Crockett, all of our majors have to go through a 4-day training course. There is a application on our website. If again, go to the hunt tab on Boone and Crockett and then become an official major, and you put in an application. All these courses are taught by either myself or the assistant director, Kyle Lair. We usually do both of them together. And so it's a pretty rare thing. The further you're willing to travel, the better. But when you come into it, limited courses or anything. Once you come to a workshop, it's, it's an intensive 4-day course. There's quizzes, there's a final test that you have to pass. But once you walk out of there, you're certified anything from a whitetail to a walrus. So all 38 categories, everything. And, it doesn't necessarily go off of experience. It's enthusiasm, how well you can represent the club, and is the area you are in underrepresented for majors. And so we'd encourage everybody to throw in an application. It's a very rewarding experience, and any questions, give me a call.
Yeah, that's cool. This question here, I have a bighorn ram taken in 2000. It was never officially scored and is now shoulder mounted. Can the mount be officially scored for Boone and Crockett now?
Yeah, it can. It's very common for us to score mounted things. In some cases, if the mount, maybe the hair was glued up a little high or something, we'll work with the trophy owner. We may need to dig down into that a little bit to get a full base measurement, but that's not a problem. A lot of what we score is historic. It's mounted. The only rule is once it's been officially measured, you can't have it done numerous times because our guys are volunteers, but there's no time, as long as it was legally taken, there's no time frame that it has to be scored in or anything. And so,
speaking of time frames, what's like the drying time?
So the drying time originally was when people would do these like month-long expeditions into the Canadian Rockies or whatever.
Yeah, okay.
It really wasn't fair that their animals couldn't get scored for a month until after they were taken. And so the club said 60 days at habitable room temperature. Again, that's what we started. In theory, after 60 days, the moisture content in them is fairly minimal. So that's the majority of the shrinkage. It's a level playing field for everything being scored at 60 days. So,
okay. So whether it's 60 days or potentially a year and a half, like there's
right.
not going to be a drastic difference.
There's a lot of drop between 0 and 60.
Okay.
But by the time you get to 60, it's, it's a curve that's leveled out. Does it continue a little bit? Yes, but it's not nearly as drastic.
What a follow-up question, and these are kind of my personal questions off the cuff, but let's just say a 320-inch bull, for example. What would you say is like a typical or maybe an average drying difference?
Completely depends on when he's taken. You shoot him right out of the velvet. There's a lot of moisture in those antlers still, and that's what's going on there. It's drying. You kill him late season, hard horn, late rut. He's been banging his head. There's not a lot of water left in that bone, and so even within the season, you'll see a varying degree of shrinkage. Of how much water's in the antler at that time. So,
gotcha.
It's honestly most of what we see, in my opinion, is more. I was excited because I shot a really big bull, and I've done it myself on my own stuff. You get serious and pull the tape type. I think that has far more to do with not quite being as big as it was in camp than actual antler shrinkage.
Like, are we talking maybe a couple of inches total? That's okay.
And there's horror stories, but real. I mean, when I killed the book mountain goat in Oregon, I scored it that night in camp. I had it officially scored by a third major. I can't do my own. Probably 90 days later and 2 years later, my wife, who's a major, pulled it down, and all 3 score charts at the exact same number.
Okay.
So sometimes there's none. Sometimes a caribou or a moose, for sure, you might see 5-6 inches on a full velvet caribou because they're just pretty much all water.
Gotcha.
So,
cool. We'll do a couple more here. Let's see. Obviously, we're talking precise measuring and scoring. I was wondering if you had any tips for quick judgment, if, for example, like a quick hunting assessment. Is there anything that you can provide there for like maybe on the hoof judging?
There's a lot of stuff written, and we've got some books that say the average width of a whitetail's eye is so many inches, and everybody kind of has their own thing. What I've found, even those work most of the time, but it's never fail safe. A deer with a big head, deer with a small head, big body, all that stuff can really throw those estimates off.
Gotcha.
At the end of the day, if you're happy with it, shoot it, figure out what it scores after. And if it's higher or lower, it really shouldn't affect the quality of your hunt at all. It's just an additional piece of the experience. So
I always heard that one growing up. It was now I can't remember the inch measurement, but antelope, pronghorn. I always heard like the eyes were so many inches wide. So like if you look at it and then use that as a judging reference point of like, oh, he's he's a 12 or a 14-inch antelope. But
When what I tell folks, if they draw a really good tag, BNC's website has all of our records on there and there's photos there. Find what the animals in that particular unit look like. The sheep from Rock Creek historically that scored really high have a different look than the big rams from the breaks. And so you look at the area and say, okay, in this area, I'm looking for a base that looks this way on the animal's head. In my opinion, that gets me a lot further than a set, an eyeball is this wide, and I'm going to extrapolate that out.
Yeah, for sure. Couple more here. Please comment about score shopping. Actually, I think you already addressed this one. Once you have an official measured score of that head, is that your score? You can't basically go shopping around for the best score.
So the purpose of that is we instruct our majors. There's going to be discrepancies. And so I take, you bring me your head, we score it, you get it back home and you look at that G4, and no matter what you do, like, I think he shorted me 2 inches. What the official policy is you as the hunter call me and I as the OM bring you in and sit down and say, did I score this correctly? If I find a 2-inch mistake, I send an email to BNC and say,
Gotcha.
hey, but what we don't want is you to go to another guy and another guy and another guy. That's why the policy's there. We want it to be done correctly. We want everybody to agree with the number. So
Gotcha. Cool. Last one here. So it looks like you're using a cable with no measurement on it. Kind of an additional part for me is like, is that a specific cable? Obviously a shoestring isn't the best one to go with. And then the follow-up is, do you then overlay measuring tape onto the spots you marked?
So what I do on the cable, first off, originally those were the original bow cables. Was what, were the old cams that have which it's now a rivet, but historically that was a bowstring. That's where that would go into the old school cams of a bow.
Okay.
That's where this came from. They don't make those cams anymore, or the bowstrings anymore, at least affordably. So we just put a rivet on there. But yeah, to that question, once you get it on there, you can mark it with either an alligator clip like this on exactly where it is. I don't know if I showed you this, but I can then hold that real quick. Transfer it to this folding carpenter's rule and get a precise measurement that way. And so that's that. Yeah, this is not marked, but we are marking where it ends and then transferring that to this rule. You can also tape your tape measure out on the table and get the same.
Gotcha. Okay.
The same effect.
You see a lot of I'm trying to think of what I would even call them. Kind of a little tape measure like that, but they're like plastic, and you give them away. I think I have one in my pack and 3 in my pickup. Like, are those, obviously it's not an official, but are you going to get much different by using one of those if you're just rough scoring?
There's a lot of things out there that all work. Right. There's items on the market that if you know how to use them, they're 100% accurate. The trophy tape, you can make that work
as long as you're putting, starting it and stopping.
Yeah, there's the same thing with the soft tape. For doing it, if you're pulling, you want to short your buddy and you want to pull on it real hard and short them, you could do that.
Yeah.
You could bunch it up. You can get pretty darn close. The official measurement, we have very specific criteria. This is the cable, this is the tape, so that's all the same. But honestly, most scoring is not going to be BNC. It's more informational than anything, and most of that stuff is fine.
Perfect. Well, we do have a giveaway for folks that are still on. We'll throw the link to that giveaway in the chat. Looks like Jack here just did that. So we're going to be giving away some onX shirts. We appreciate you guys sticking on. Hopefully you learned a bunch. I know I personally did. And that's just a couple of the species. I'm sure if you get into, pronghorn and all sorts of other stuff, it can get pretty extensive. So anyways, we appreciate you guys sticking on, and just a reminder, this will be on YouTube, so you can reference it. You can share it with your buddies after the fact, and keep those questions coming in. Maybe we'll have to do another one of these here in a handful more months, and hopefully I've got one of those big deer with here's the green tape and the red tape, and we all have to count it by that. So.
We might need 2 hours for that one though.
Yeah, perfect. Well, awesome. Anything else?
No, I think that's good.
Perfect. Well, thanks guys. We appreciate you tuning in, and One other thing, check out the landing page on our website for upcoming webinars. Get signed up for those. Throw your name in. We'll remind you when they are. Even if you can't make it, get signed up if you're interested, because then we'll email you out that webinar and make sure you're notified when that does get put on YouTube. So thanks, guys.